So, I think we can probably kick things off now, and then people can kind of filter in as we go along. My name is Dr. Alice Houldey, lecturer in sociology here at Robert Gordon University within the School of Applied Social Studies. I organise the school's community seminar series, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming along this evening. We're really, really glad that you could join us on what is a very, very Tuesday night. So just a couple of housekeeping things to cover before we begin. There'll be time for questions at the end of this talk, and if you have questions, you can pop them in the chat panel for me to feed onto our speaker without us all navigating, muting and unmuting and all of those kinds of things. You can add those questions as we go along or at the end, whatever's best for you. I'm just seeing a couple of comments saying that the sound is okay. Great. Not sure what happened there. This talk will be recorded and it will be posted on the university's YouTube channel. So any questions that you post for the speaker will be asked anonymously, and you'll be able to catch the recording when it's on YouTube in a couple of weeks. So on to today. We're thrilled to have Dr. Gemma Houldey join us to give her a talk on her upcoming book, The Vulnerable Humanitarian, Ending Burnout Culture in the Aid Sector. The book draws on 6 years of research into stress and well-being in the aid and development sector, including doctoral research in Kenya, and on her 15 years experience working for humanitarian and human rights organizations. Gemma is a writer, advisor, and facilitator on cultivating healthy and inclusive working practices in the aid and development sector. She's worked on humanitarian and human rights programs in East Africa and the Middle East, and in 2019 completed her PhD in international development at the University of Sussex, which investigated stress and burnout among international and national aid workers in Kenya. So I shall hand over to you, Gemma.
Thank you, Alice, and hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share some of the ideas from my book. I'm aware that it's probably a really mixed audience, so I'm going to try and sort of condense a lot of ideas that I feel will be relevant for everyone, not just aid workers and people within my sector. So we'll give that a go, but of course there'll be time for questions and discussion at the end as well. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, so my book is due out later this year, hopefully in September, and it's entitled The Vulnerable Humanitarian, Ending Burnout Culture in the Aid Sector. I'm going to plug it straight away and say it is available for pre-order on the Routledge website, but also on Amazon as well. And really what the book does is draws together, as Alice was saying, it draws together research that I conducted in Kenya on stress and well-being, which was ethnographic, qualitative research over the period of about a year, and interviewing and speaking to a number of different aid workers, Kenyans and international staff. And it also draws on my experience as well, having worked in the sector, having gone through my own burnout, and having recovered as well, and gone on quite a journey of exploring healing modalities, but also kind of, what does it mean to work in organizations that make people feel ill, and how can we change that? How can we change the organizational culture? So I'm going to be discussing some of the research findings and some of the recommendations in the book as well. So it's not just about all the problems of burnout, but also what can be done to change that as well. And really at the heart of that is looking at power dynamics within organizations, and becoming more aware of these power dynamics in order to have real systemic and collective change. And really the book in that sense is about the inner work that we need to do and the collective work we need to do to overcome these problems of burnout and trauma with this kind of work. So I will also present some of the guideposts that are in the book for assessing organisational culture within the aid sector, to sort of really look at what things need to be checked in order to address some of the problems that I'm going to be discussing. And I'll also share with you some of the more practice-based, it's all practice-based really, the recommendations, but some specifically focused on self and collective care. And that's, a lot of this is drawn from organisations and individuals that are doing this work already. They're really trying to transform the sector. And what the book is trying to codify all that knowledge, all that experience about what's being done, what can change, and bringing that all together. So definitely giving a lot of acknowledgement to those out there who are doing this already, particularly individuals and organisations in the Global South. So just to touch a little bit on my approach, I'm essentially taking a feminist, anti-racist and decolonial agenda in what I write and what I propose. What does this mean? Now, I could talk about this for hours and hours, so I'm going to try and sort of summarise a few of the main things of what this means. And first of all, it is recognising visible and hidden forms of power and how they affect an individual's ability to achieve purpose. And this is really recognising that there are particular voices that dominate in the aid and development sector, particular knowledge that gets greater attention. And when it comes to spaces and decision making, there are particular people that dominate that space. So it's trying to really look at, what are the voices we're hearing, what are the narratives we're hearing, and what receives less attention. That's also applying to the processes and systems within aid organisations and how they might give advantage for some people whilst really creating a lot of disadvantage and obstacles for others. Also, this kind of agenda means a commitment to highlighting diversity and difference and to cultivating inclusivity. So what this means is really getting beyond the assumption that white is right. So it is talking about racism within the sector and our own socialization around how we speak up and how we some of us may dominate the space more than others. So it's recognizing that my reality isn't everyone's reality, and that my preference for how things are done or said doesn't matter more than anyone else's. Also, it's about understanding the lived realities of people from marginalized groups and letting them lead the way in how social change happens, particularly in their context, in their own context. And this is very important when we consider that aid and development work is essentially taking place in the Global South, but is so often being led by the Global North, which leads to this third point, addressing the white saviour complex. We need to recognise, and I'm sure in this audience today, many of you know this, that the aid and development space is very much dominated by white knowledge and decision making. And we need to challenge this by shifting power to the Global South so that people from these regions, from these communities, can lead in how aid is delivered and how policies and practices are developed to support local communities. And this also, when we consider mental health and burnout, it also includes broadening our understanding about mental health, not relying solely on Western clinical models, but also on the approaches and practices that have supported people in situations of ongoing violence and hardship, where there isn't the same kind of access to health services, and perhaps there are other coping mechanisms in place that we can learn from as well. So that's just some of my take on a feminist, anti-racist, decolonial agenda. And like I say, there's much more I could say about it. There's a lot of around this in the book as well. So let's just get on to the next slide. So really what I was setting out to do when I conducted my research was to interrogate some of the assumptions, both within and beyond the aid sector, about what the work entails and about how mental health is talked about and approached by aid workers. And this includes this sort of very common public image of aid workers as heroes, as these kind of unflappable, really tough individuals who go out. They don't show their emotions. They don't wear their heart on their sleeves, which is ironic, given humanitarian work is coming from this place of compassion and care, and yet very often we are expected to be heroic. And this is problematic for a number of reasons, but coming back to this idea of the white savior complex, it comes back to how the sort of language and cultures and systems of aid are very much dictated by how white people in the global north think people should behave and what's expected of us as aid workers. And what this is often called, and this is a term coined by a Liberian academic called Robtel Nije Pillai, is the white lens of development. The idea that the language, culture, and systems of aid work are dominated by people with privilege from the global north, and their specific ideas and concerns around how people with less privilege may be helped. So my research and the book was trying to highlight some of the everyday realities for national staff working in their own countries in the global south. And it's important to recognise here and remember that the majority of the aid sector, the workforce, is made up of national staff in these contexts. It's about 90%. Yet we hear very little about their stories, their motivations, their challenges, and also the fact that there is a huge inequality in terms of the kind of support they receive from their employers, the compensation, the salaries that they receive compared with their international counterparts, and their opportunities for career progression as well. So I was trying to highlight in the book how all of these feed into our understanding of burnout and of what well-being means as well. What does it mean to be well in the sector? So I'm going to go through some of the main kind of headline problems that came out of the research and are contained in the book. And as I said, it's very hard for me to sort of pull it all together in this short time, but I'm going to do my best. So one of the issues here is that what constitutes stress is complex. So I'm going to just show, as I go through this, a few choice quotes from my research that kind of highlights this complexity. So first of all, this is from a Dutch woman who went through her own quite serious burnout working with a human rights organization in Kenya, and had a lot of physical problems, a lot of physical difficulties, as well as a lot of mental health difficulties. And she received counselling, took a long period of sick leave from her employer before in the end having to leave because she could not stay in that work. But what's interesting here is her comments about her experience to a Congolese colleague of hers, and the fact that her Congolese colleague didn't really even know what this term was. What's a burnout? What does it mean? So it kind of raises this question, this assumption that this term burnout is, it's been bandied about within the aid and development sector, and certainly I know in other circles as well, activist circles, but does it have the same sort of relevance or application or understanding in different cultures and different contexts? And this other quote here sort of builds on this point, and this is from a Kenyan aid worker. By the way, these aren't their real names, in case anyone's concerned. In the research, everyone was anonymized, and I was also protecting the identity of their employer as well, because it's a sensitive topic. So, for instance, one of the Kenyan people I spoke to, this was in Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya, and he was making the point of like, well, we don't necessarily talk about stress in our culture because so many of us are kind of born into this every day. Why would my issue be bigger than someone else's? And I heard something kind of similar also from some Somali aid workers I spoke to who were based in Mogadishu. I met them in Kenya, but they were based in Mogadishu. And, their day-to-day work entails just traveling to the office is a risk in terms of potential armed attacks, shootings, bombings, all of these possibilities. That some had lost family members or had been injured. And yet there was a kind of attitude of, well, we have to do this to get on with the work, and almost kind of joking about the popcorn going off. They mentioned the popcorn going off when they could hear gunshots. Now, what I'm trying to highlight here is not that, oh, African people don't experience stress or trauma. It's more that when you're living in those environments, you're going to approach stress and understand your experience very differently from an expat aid worker such as myself, who flies in for a few weeks or maybe only a few days at a time, and also it often receives greater protections and certainly can be flown out and evacuated in a way that doesn't quite apply when you are living in that situation permanently. So that was really what I was trying to highlight here, is that, for some, stress is part of the everyday. And in a way, workplace stress is not necessarily high up the agenda when there's all sorts of other issues going on as well. But this also links to why people don't talk about stress in the workplace. And again, there's complexity to this. And certainly within the aid sector, I can talk from my own experience. It's very hard to sort of really talk about your feelings and what you're absorbing each day, what you're witness to each day. And certainly I've had experiences of going into the office, having interviewed victims of torture, victims of really terrible violence back to back, and being exposed to that and feeling really, I suppose, drained and upset and distressed by it, and yet not being able to share that really with my colleagues. So why is that? Why is that happening? So here is another quote from a UN worker who was, and I heard this from other UN workers as well, was basically suggesting that it's very hard to talk about these things without fear of being judged, about possibly losing your job. We see this more broadly as well in recent years with issues around sexual misconduct in the sector, which I'm sure many of you have heard about. The real threat to whistleblowers and people that wanted to speak out on sexual abuse was very, very real, and certainly impacted a lot of people in terms of job loss or bullying from their managers. So this is a problem that I saw time and time again. And what was interesting is that a lot of these organizations, certainly UN agencies and others, have a counseling service in place, and yet people aren't necessarily using it. So this leads me to another quote here from a Kenyan man based in Nairobi, saying that that there is a counselling service, but he wouldn't feel comfortable going for counselling in case that got back to HR, and then he could be judged also as being incompetent and incapable of doing his job. So that's where we see this culture where burnout is happening and people aren't really able to speak up and speak up about some of the problems that they're having for fear of being judged, because there is this kind of hero narrative running through it that we have to be really tough and unflappable. So another point here is that's running through all of this is the systems of inequity within aid and development organizations, and how this affects people's ability to talk about stress, and to really receive support when they do talk about it as well. And one of the big problems here is the dual salary system within aid and development organisations. And I am talking here about international NGOs and UN agencies as opposed to national organisations that are solely based in the global south. So it's very common to have this dual salary system where, as an international staff, you are paid more, and you also receive extra benefits. You might have your house paid for. You might be given a car. You might have particular extra support when it comes to traveling outside of the area that you work in. These are all things that I saw within my own experience as an international aid worker, working in different contexts in the global south, that it was very clear that I had far more benefits available to me than a lot of my national counterparts, and far more protections when it comes to things like being evacuated from a disaster area. So I just want to return to one of the previous informants on the previous slide, Samuel. And Samuel, who's a Kenyan man, he, for instance, as an example, he had to travel. He was based in Nairobi, but his wife was based in another part of Kenya. He had to travel there to visit her when he could. Not always easy when so many pressures from his employer to travel with work. And he would do this at his own expense. It'd be quite hard to fit that in, to make that arrangement. And in addition to which, he told me he had a lot of members of his family depending on him, which again, quite common in Kenya. I found that there were people with many dependents and paying school fees for them and supporting them in other ways, and yet on often a lower salary and less compensation or reward from their employer than their international counterparts. And then if you compare with a lot of the expats from the global north, they perhaps didn't have quite these family responsibilities and certainly wouldn't necessarily have to travel far inside the country to visit their family members. There was another example of this from Kakuma refugee camp, a UN worker I met there, his family lived, again, the other side of Kenya, right in the southwest, and he was up in the north. He'd only get to see them every couple of months for his rest and recuperation, which is a kind of standard procedure for people working in disaster areas. They can go and take a break every couple of months for about 5 to 10 days, where they can go and see their family, or they can just have a break elsewhere in a sort of more relaxed environment. But for someone like him, this Kenyan man, it entailed a long journey, often by road, because he would have to pay for a flight to get out of the disaster area, in order to go and see his wife and children. Again, a situation that didn't apply in quite the same way to his expat colleagues who had their flights paid for to leave the area to go and see, often go and see their friends in Nairobi or something like that. So two very, very different experiences there, creating extra stress and extra challenge on that day-to-day level that goes beyond the kind of the critical incident or the things that we often associate with stressful situations in the aid and development sector. So just staying with this topic of inequity, we can also see that there are multiple and intersecting layers of difference among aid workers, which affects their opportunities for career development, how they are treated, and how easily they can ask for and receive help. And this can be illustrated here with, again, a couple of quotes from women that I spoke to. So first of all, this was from a young Kenyan woman I met in Kakuma refugee camp, who was trying to just highlight to me the sort of societal pressures on her as a woman. She was really committed to her work. She really enjoyed working in the refugee camp. It's something that she'd really studied hard for, and yet she felt she probably couldn't stay in that kind of work because the patriarchal structures around her would dictate that this isn't what's expected of her as a woman, and that she would be judged harshly if she carried on that path, that she may not even be able to find a partner in that kind of context. So she was considering leaving the sector and doing something else, even though she was kind of quite early on in her career. And this was quite different from the Kenyan men I met in Kakuma, who had a wife and children in another part of the country, and they were able to continue their work without that consideration being in place, without that being an issue for them. And not to say that their wife and children may have also found this a very challenging situation as well. And this is from an Ethiopian woman based in the US who I spoke to last year, who was really trying to highlight some of the problems experienced by Black women, and this includes Black women from the global North as well, as to why we don't hear their struggles so much, and we don't hear so much of the impacts of these inequities on people from marginalized groups, and really making the point that certainly from her experience, there is a silencing. It's very difficult for a Black woman such as herself to speak up about some of the imbalances in the system and mistreatment within the sector, which again goes back to what I was saying earlier. Why is it that when we think about sexual abuse within the sector, something we've heard a lot about, it has mainly been white women that we've heard from. And I really respect that white women have spoken up about this. It won't have been easy for them either. So I want to give acknowledgement to that. But it is still a discussion that has largely been dominated by white women. And we have to sort of question why that is. What are the stories we're not hearing and why, and how this relates to these inequities that I've been describing in terms of kind of who gets greater protections, who gets greater reward and acknowledgement for their work, and who feels more marginalized and less appreciated. So a question here that I came to in the book is, how do we acknowledge and challenge these differences so that aid organizations truly walk the talk in challenging oppressive behaviors and practices and ensuring equity runs through all that they do? And that's really what part 2 of my book is about. It's what are the practices that we need to put in place for ourselves and sort of throughout the system to recognize these problems and to overcome them and to work in a different way. So one of the things I propose are a series of guideposts to assess an organization's culture. And these are guideposts which seek to codify some of the existing knowledge and some of the existing knowledge on the intersection between organizational culture, power, and well-being. They're informed by my own research findings and the discussions I've had with a number of different practitioners that are working on this, and people who are really challenging the way aid work is done and leading the way in arguing for systemic and collective change. And this is a really sort of big issue at the moment. Again, following on the heels of multiple allegations of sexual abuse within the sector, and how we change that culture to stop these things from happening, and how we all take responsibility. What's the inner work that we need to do, and what's the collective work that we need to do? So the guideposts focus on both the wider systems and processes that enable or restrict feelings of belonging in an organization, but also they focus on the specific issues around practices and support systems that are available that make people feel happy, safe, and well. I'm just going to go through some of them. I'm not going through everything in great detail. I'll plug the book again and say, buy the book. It's got a much more detail as to what all of these guideposts are. So I'm only going to go through a few of them. And they're followed usually with some reflective questions for individuals and organizations to consider in addressing these guideposts. So one of the guideposts, or a collection of the guideposts actually, is probably a better way of describing it, is to level the playing field with how staff are recruited, trained, and rewarded. And this is really acknowledging what came out of my research findings, that it's often the knowledge and expertise of white expatriates that are favoured in recruitment processes. So someone like myself who has studied at an elite university in Europe, on a subject that's relevant to the sort of career path that I'm following, and the fact that I also am able to cross borders with ease, to travel from one place to another because of the kind of passport I've got. And just sort of recognizing how that immediately gives me more benefits. And how can we change this so that we recognize, for instance, the experiences of national staff from the global south, what their lived experience can bring to the work they're doing. And again, this isn't always acknowledged in a sort of typical job description. So some questions that I pose here to actually really address this guidepost are, for instance, what is your salary structure for national and international staff, and how do you justify it? Is it based on the requirements or the demands or the location of the job, or is it based on nationality? And certainly traditionally, it has very often been based on nationality. You're either a national staff or you're an international staff, and there's not much consideration of the actual skills of the job and the requirements of the job, and what's actually needed, where you need to be placed, how often you need to travel, and really creating opportunities for different people within the broader aid sector to apply for that kind of work. And also, do your reward and security policies take into account the specific needs and realities of national staff, and particularly those who are working in remote locations away from family? I think this is really important now when we're considering the pandemic as well, and the impact that the pandemic has had on the workforce, and this greater dependence on national staff in the global south, and yet still they're not being compensated the same amount as their international colleagues. They're not receiving the same protections as their international colleagues, and they are being exposed to greater risk, not just of the virus, but greater risk generally with the kind of work that they're doing on the ground in situations of violence or instability, or any of the other kind of typical humanitarian situations that they are exposed to. So that's just one of the guideposts, and it goes into greater detail in the book in terms of principles and standards around fair reward, and really what organisations need to be looking at when they consider how they support and compensate their staff. Secondly, I suggest that we rethink leadership and hierarchy. And this is really adopting a feminist approach to leadership. And it's an approach which creates an enabling environment where everyone is capable of becoming a leader, no matter your background, no matter your gender, your race, your class, sexual orientation, or any of these other aspects. It's giving everyone that space and that opportunity. It's also an approach that has the potential to break through traditional masculinized notions of leadership and hierarchy, which are associated with being a leader, particularly this notion of heroism again. How do we move beyond this idea that as leaders, as humanitarian workers, we have to always be heroic and not acknowledge our limitations, or not acknowledge that perhaps we need to change, or there's something we're not doing right. And instead, it's advocating a leadership that's committed to exposing unequal power structures and working towards more inclusive, collective change. And this certainly comes back to why this book's called The Vulnerable Humanitarian. It's about how do we bring vulnerability into our work as well, and overcome this perfectionism, this idea that we must get things right all the time. So some of the questions that I pose here on this guidepost include: what are the decision-making processes or consultation or feedback processes in your organization? How much is there an effort for it to be kind of 360 degrees, not just one way, so that leaders also are asking, how are we doing? Or what kind of leadership do you need from me? Also, do people feel they have a genuine say in how policies are developed? And this is very important when we consider some of the policies that are affecting staff directly, like safeguarding policies on the back of addressing sexual abuse within the sector. How much is there leadership coming from people who are directly affected by this in the global south, rather than policies being led by head offices in Europe? So just really considering how the decision-making processes and the policy formulation processes as well. And thirdly, making well-being strategies inclusive. And this is really sort of trying to tie together, what the approaches are to staff care in an organization, and how to really have an inclusive and certainly an anti-racist agenda in the well-being approaches. And I think there are two things that are really important here when we consider staff care. Firstly, we need to move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach and the tendency to only have individualized support mechanisms which place the burden of recovering from stress or burnout on the employee. So many organizations have a counseling system in place. They might offer yoga or meditation classes, and all of these may be very important and very helpful for many people, but it's nevertheless very much an individualized approach. It's suggesting that it's down to the employee. It's their choice, their responsibility to make themselves better. And it's not really addressing the systemic problems that lead to stress and burnout. So it's letting employers off the hook. So it's the need to really think beyond this kind of what can be a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach of just having a counselling service in place. And secondly, another important point here is that we need to consider that there are different approaches to stress, trauma, and well-being, which acknowledge the lived realities and the diversity within the sector, and really sort of respect different approaches that are coming certainly from individuals from marginalised groups and from the global south that perhaps don't fit within the strategies that we might think work for everyone. So some questions I pose around this are: what or who informs your understanding of well-being and abuse and trauma and indeed burnout, and the necessary well-being interventions and strategies? So again, recognizing that what works for someone like me may not work for a Kenyan aid worker. And indeed, what I found in my research was that certainly religion played a major role in supporting many Kenyan aid workers and also Somali aid workers I spoke to, in motivating them for the work that they did, but also in supporting them as well, in supporting them through struggle and challenge, in a way that's not really recognized within organizations, because religion is often seen as a bit sort of a taboo topic, or it's seen as cultural in some way and not related to the work. But actually, this is about really allowing everyone to be their whole full selves, to bring their whole selves into the workplace and to feel a sense of belonging. And so really considering what well-being means is one gateway to that, and how there is going to be diversity in how people understand well-being. Secondly, another question is, do well-being strategies pay particular attention to the specific needs of people from marginalized groups, but people that perhaps have specific experiences and struggles working in remote settings, working in insecure areas? So I'm thinking certainly women, menstruating women. What's the reality, the particular needs for menstruating women in the sector working in remote areas? Sometimes in very patriarchal areas as well, where there aren't many other women around, and sort of the discomfort that creates. But also for LGBTQ plus people who, obviously might feel very much at risk or threatened in settings where homosexuality is criminalized in some way. So how much attention is being paid to that? And lastly, what's the kind of imagery and resources and imagery and resources being used for wellbeing strategies? How inclusive are they? So, for instance, if you have a counselling service in place, who are the counsellors? Are they all white people from the global north? And is that really going to make, say, a Kenyan aid worker feel comfortable speaking about their experiences? Likewise as well for LGBTQ plus people, trying to ensure that the support they receive is with someone they feel they can open up to as well. But it also stretches out to the sort of basic things of the way that we publicize well-being, so that it's not just about yoga and meditation, which I practice yoga and meditation myself. I'm a yoga teacher, so I certainly value it as a practice. It's supported me. But what can we learn from staff from the global south about their traditions, about their practices, about what works for them? How can those be brought into the workplace a little bit more as well? So those are some of the questions that I consider through the guideposts. And then really what I move on to is the how. What does this mean on a practical level? What do we need to look at in order to sort of have these conversations, in order to assess our organizational culture? And so in the book, I take people through a 4-step integral process of self and collective care. I'm not going to go through every step here, but the idea is really trying to support people in embodying their emotions and their feelings, embodying their values, so they're really in touch with what matters to them in terms of perhaps their health, but also in terms of why they're doing the work they're doing. And by giving more attention to our own inner processes, our own belief systems that perhaps aren't always helpful, we're able to connect more to others as well and understand each other in a sort of different way. So that's the idea, is how to create spaces where people feel whole, where people feel safe to open up, where mental health can be talked about and discussed, and where it's valued on an individual level and on a collective level as well. How to move beyond our perfectionism, to take off our professional masks, not to have those on all the time, to admit our limitations. So also how to create communication around that so we can be more open and we can be more vulnerable. I'm going to summarize some of the main ideas in that section of the book without going into that whole process. And this is really about how to cultivate brave spaces. We often hear about safe spaces, and I think safe spaces is quite a subjective experience. We cannot dictate if someone feels safe or not. It's not up to me to decide if someone feels safe or not. But what we can encourage is for people to be brave. And so what does this mean in practice? What I suggest in the book is, for instance, bringing ritual into the workplace. So ritual doesn't have to mean something that's too spiritual or occult, or I think often that word can create some discomfort and some kind of assumptions about what that can mean. But really, I would say central to my own healing process, healing from burnout, has been ritual. It's been about coming together with others and exploring together, and connecting to and processing the suffering that we share in a space that feels intentional, protected, and safe. So how can we create that kind of environment for each other, where ritual can open us up and make us feel a bit more relaxed, so that we can talk more honestly about what's going on for us? I make all sorts of suggestions as to what that could look like, from things like forming a listening partnership, where this could be with one other person or in a group of people, where you simply are there to hold space for each other, to listen to whatever needs to be expressed without judgment, without any feedback unless it's asked for, without trying to find solutions, but just learning to really listen. But also, it might be shorter things that you introduce into your working day, such as 3 minutes of meditation and mindfulness at the start of a meeting, or 3 minutes of honest check-ins where you're actually talking about your feelings before you go into your meeting agenda, or finishing a meeting with maybe some kind of poem or a prayer or a proverb to sort of energize people and motivate people. Or something even more kind of wacky that some people do, which is to dance together, to share a playlist of your favorite music within your team, and to have a dance at the end of the week, which is something that I do know people have been doing even during lockdown online. So just those sorts of ways of opening up a different part of yourself and feeling more human with each other. Secondly, creating a feedback culture. And this is important for everyone, but it's very important for leaders, for leaders to become more vulnerable in their work and what they're doing, and to perhaps ask of their colleagues, what does leadership mean to you? Or what leadership would you like to see from me? What should I stop doing? Or what should I keep on doing? Asking those sorts of open questions. So you're inviting a conversation about culture change, essentially. But also, I'd like to share some of these statements which come from Brené Brown, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. She's a scholar and a speaker on vulnerability and how to be vulnerable in the workplace and outside of it. And she suggests these statements to sort of bring into the workplace. I'll just read a few of them out. I don't know. I need help. I disagree. Can we talk about it? Here's what I need. I'd like some feedback. What can I do better next time? How can you teach me how to do this? I played a part in that. I accept responsibility for that. And I'm here for you. So just some simple statements to bring in. And there's more in the book about what I call courageous communications, particularly around mental health and around issues such as racism as well. Lastly, finding your support section. And this is just the idea that no matter who we are, we need people to turn to. We need allies in this journey of feminist, anti-racist change within our organizations. So I do think it's essential for that kind of work that we know who we can turn to, not just to have our lots of support given to us the whole time. We need to have the kind of support where we're also challenged, where people understand the journey that we're on, because they're also on it as well. and they understand your struggles and your positioning within the work that you do, and respect you fully for who you are, but also willing to challenge you where perhaps you slip up or mistakes are made, and to do so in a loving way. And certainly this goes back to the whole kind of agenda here, I feel, for the book, is about how we bring compassion back into the workplace, how we bring our humanity back into the workplace. And it certainly starts from within, and it starts from how we connect with each other, with our colleagues. I do believe that that can then lead further out in terms of how we support the communities we work in as well. So I'm going to finish there, and just open it up for questions. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gemma. That was brilliant, and I really like the fact that there was some actual suggestions at the end of things that we can incorporate into many different sectors. And it looked like from the chat there were lots of different sectors that people were coming from. So yeah, we can open this up to questions if people have anything that they'd like to ask. There was certainly discussion going on in the chat panel during your talk, Gemma, about the sectors that different people have come from. And it really was a wide range of backgrounds, which is excellent then that so many different people are here today. We've got some people who are university students looking to work in the humanitarian sector, which is exciting. And then discussions around an interesting discussion about the fact that at field level, you're often made to feel guilty if you show signs of stress and mental health issues. I don't know if that's something that you want to, or sometimes the foreign workers' family lives in the capital and they can see them with flights paid for by the organisation.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely going back to the kind of differences between national and international staff. And I'd just like to say as well that in itself is a term which becomes a bit offensive and uncomfortable after a while. You know, sort of just throwing people into a national staff category, and sort of the inequalities that entails as well. So you know, we do need new language around all of these things. But just going back to that point, I think there are a lot of benefits and allowances available if you are an international staff, in terms of how you travel if you need to get from one place in the country that you're working in to another, and often having your flight paid for, in a way that doesn't always apply to national staff. And that's certainly what I found, is that a lot of national staff are paying to get from one place to another, and so often they are working for long term, not just for 1 or 2 year contracts, as is often the case with international staff. They're working for years and years in one location, hundreds of miles away from their family. And they do this because that's the work that's available to them. So, you know, in a country where employment isn't as easy for everyone, and it's still scarce, people take the job that's possible for them. And so they're then only able to see their family members every 8 to 10 weeks, and have to often do a really long journey to get there. Even that can take 2 days up of their rest and recuperation period, just getting there. And then when they get there, they've got all sorts of responsibilities upon them in terms of being with their family, financial support to their family, payment of school fees for other family members. There's those sorts of pressures that were very, very clear among the Kenyan aid workers I met, which simply do not apply to the majority of certainly European or American aid workers in quite the same way. And it's just recognizing that there are those extra challenges that are faced for staff based in those countries and working in those contexts.
Thank you. We've got a question. Having been in this position as an expat aid worker yourself, I was wondering what research findings most surprised you or you hadn't realised before.
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I would say that, well, I'd like to say studying a PhD is a privilege, and it's a privilege that only some of us have. So recognising my own privilege within that. But what it has taught me is a lot more about these sorts of complexities than when I was working solidly within the sector, where there's no time to unpack these things. And, there's a bit of guilt of the fact that I receive more benefits than my national colleagues. But, we then carry on and we don't question or interrogate things because there's not time. But I feel that doing the PhD certainly uncovered a lot of things that I had not really given attention to properly before. I think certainly our assumptions around mental health and well-being and what that means, I found that really interesting. There were a number of African aid workers. What I mean is there were Kenyans, there were Somalis, and there were Ugandans who I spoke to kind of made this point, sometimes sort of half jokingly, of, oh, we don't have stress in our society. What do you mean by stress? What is this thing? But sort of making the point of, we've got bigger things to worry about than what's going on in our workplace. And that's not to say that we should therefore ignore the problems in the workplace. It's all a systemic issue, and we need to recognise that actually for a Kenyan that there are lots of challenges going on that aren't just purely related to the work. So I think that was definitely a big insight for me. I think also just the extent of bullying of people that do speak up is quite shocking. And I think this really came out certainly during the sexual problems of sexual abuse, when all these allegations came out 3 years ago. And more and more, the AIDS 2 movement was born, and more women were speaking up, but really getting into trouble for that. So I think that's been a real eye-opener and a real concern. But I think as well, just generally the fact that people are not, we assume with stress that or trauma or burnout that it's related to what's called the critical incident. It's related to a particular situation that happens where someone's put at risk, or they're exposed to extreme suffering in some way, and that's what causes illness. And of course, often it does. But I think actually it's the day-to-day grind, the day-to-day realities of not feeling supported by your employer, of not feeling heard, of job insecurity, of contracts not lasting very long, of the constant cycle of organisational change and restructuring and how badly that's done most of the time. That was the thing that people were talking about, and the disparities between national and international staff and compensation. Those were the things that came up more vividly, I felt, as well as, of course, cases of specific traumatic incidents, which are there in the book as well.
Thank you. We have another question. It's quite long, so I might pause halfway through. Part of why people leave is because the system is not responsive and the inequality is so severe. What advice would you give to those who face the systemic stresses and need to still navigate within these unhealthy contexts? Part 2. Or do you suggest to keep leaving whenever possible when the breaking point and trade-offs no longer equate, and/or when the institutions refuse to participate in the needed change?
Yeah, big questions, and I'm sure speaking to many people in this audience and beyond it of the challenges. It's hard for me to answer the first question because I'd love to say that my book gives all the answers and it's all going to be wonderful from now on, but I know that's not the case, and I know that culture change, particularly burnout culture, it's going to take a long time, and we are very, very set in our ways about how stuff is done. And as you're saying, people don't listen, they're not responsive, nothing changes. And I think at a certain point you have to work out where to put your energies. Like, what battle is worth fighting for the greater good as well as your own good, and which ones are which ones should you walk away from for your own health. And that's it. I do talk about this in the book, about your boundaries and about knowing your yes and knowing your no, and what that really means in practice. And it's recognizing that we cannot always be the fighter and we cannot always fight the system. And at some point, we have to step back and see that, perhaps we do have to walk away. I would say that things are changing. There is more attention now to organizational culture change. Certainly, lots of NGOs are talking about it at the moment. My fear is that it will be much like the whole aid and development system. It will be this kind of idea of let's change everything in 3 years, or 1 year, or whatever unreasonable timeline. And that's not going to work. It's a longer term commitment, and not something you as a staff member are necessarily going to see the big changes in your lifetime in that organization. So just to sort of say, I think change is happening, but it is gradual and it does take time. I just want to go back to the second part of the question. Well, perhaps I've answered both parts of that question there anyway. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's excellent. And we've got another question that feeds on quite nicely to that. How to ensure self-well-being when your supervisor treats you in a demeaning manner and shows the senior management that you are no use for work without addressing the hard work, which is making individuals less confident and less motivated to work, although you're giving your best to achieve project goals?
Yeah, I'm just reading through the question as well, bit by bit, so I can take it in properly. Yeah, I mean, again, it is kind of about figuring out your yes and your no. Like, how much are you willing to persist in the job that you're doing and enjoy the job that you're doing with a belief that things can change? I do think as well, it is very important to have your own allies in this endeavour, and not to feel that you've got to do all this alone, which I think again is quite a typical thing with aid workers, and or a typical habit anyway with someone who's a carer or in the helping professions. This idea that we have to do it all, we have to achieve change all by ourselves, and that includes within the work context, within among staff and with our managers as well. So really finding others that can support you in this work, whether that is your colleagues or someone outside of that that can coach you, give you advice, mentorship around, what's going to support you. And ultimately it does come down to you. I mean, you can't expect always expect the change to happen, that your expectations may not be fulfilled in terms of someone changing their behavior, but what you can do is change how you respond to it, what's going to support you in that response. And again, there's more about that in the book, about how we really look after ourselves in this process and at least create something that we believe in, or model behavior that we think is supportive and compassionate, even if that's not what we see around us, because this is how change is generated. It's not straightforward, of course, and as I say, it's not necessarily going to lead to change in someone else's behavior. But I do think finding that support for yourself and starting that process from within in terms of how you respond to the situation in front of you.
That's great. And we have another question and follow-on question that tie in nicely there as well. So thank you so much for the great presentation, so much insightful information. What can one do when a person refuses to stop working or properly take care of themselves, even though they're quite clearly heading towards burnout because of the purpose and validation they get from the work? And to add to that, when that person is a senior colleague who then expects others to work at that tempo.
Oh gosh, yeah. I think we've all been in that situation. I certainly have. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a question there about leadership and what leadership should be, and it certainly should be modeling behavior that's supportive for staff as well, and not sending emails off at weekends or in the evenings. And so there's something there about sort of the kind of things, the kind of practices that others can follow, but certainly you yourself can do as well, in putting those boundaries in place of, of when to respond to emails, when not to, when to take a break, when you're spending time with your family, and actually vocalizing that and saying that's what you're going to do, sort of modeling that behavior. But just to go back to that sort of original question around how to support people that clearly aren't taking breaks when they need to, and they're clearly struggling and having mental health problems. There's one tool which I recommend in the book called the Wellness Action Plan, which is it's developed by the UK charity Mind. So it's very much geared towards how to address mental health issues in the workplace. And it's co-creative, and it's also with a view of not just being of being preventative as well as just responding or reactive. And the idea is that it's a conversation really that a manager has with a staff member, but I wonder if this is also something that colleagues can do with each other. A conversation around what the workplace triggers are, what the impact is on that staff member's health, how that shows up in terms of their behaviour, and what kind of support they need, which might include what support they can give themselves, what self-care strategies can they put in place themselves, but also what support they can receive from their manager. And it's a plan that you develop together that can then be reviewed over time, so you can then go back to it and say, so how are we doing with this, or has anything changed? Maybe the workplace triggers are different now. But putting something in, so you're therefore putting something in place that recognizes the kind of specifics of why people are struggling, and opens up a conversation, basically, because sometimes we don't really know, and it's hard for people to articulate, and it's also hard to ask the question of what exactly is wrong. But again, there's a whole lot more on that in the book that's about just everyday communication, having honest check-ins, starting a meeting, spending 5 minutes saying what I'm happy about, what I'm sad about, what I'm excited about, what I'm fearful about. It's getting people to talk from that place, so that you're opening up that conversation and that sense of safety, that it's a discussion, a conversation about mental health is welcome. So yeah, it's also about those sort of day-to-day, bringing that into the workplace as much as you can.
Thank you. And I think that's certainly from somebody not in the aid sector that you're talking about. I think there's a lot that's attributable across multiple platforms you're talking about as well, which is hopefully then that's something that everyone's been able to take from this talk. So I think we can probably start wrapping things up. If anyone does have any last minute questions, if you just want to pop something in the chat box, so that as like a placeholder, so that we know that you're coming back to ask a question. In the meantime, I can just tell you that we have the last event of this session before we have a break for the summer. And the event on the 15th of June is from Dr. David Smith, who is giving a talk entitled Taking Matters into Their Own Hands, Lockdown and the NoFap Community. So a very, very different talk, possibly not suitable for younger viewers or listeners, or if there are younger people around, but hopefully some interesting, very different research. We've had one last thing that just in the chat box, that is a website been shared with a list of resources of talks that might be useful, and other mindfulness and compassion related resources that might be helpful. So that's in the chat if anyone is interested in that. But other than that, it's just to say thank you so much to Gemma for a fantastic talk, and thank you to everyone for coming along. As I said at the beginning, it's a really beautiful evening, so thank you for giving some of your time to come along. I hope you were able to have the windows open at least and get some sunshine at the same time. So yeah, thank you for a great talk, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for some wonderful questions as well.